From emerging threat to meticulously planned military network, it's 1 year since ISIL seized Iraq's second largest city and international attention. How is the fight being waged against the group and by the group for territory and allegiance? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Mike Hanna. It's a year since the group known as ISIL staked its black flag over Mosul, Iraq's second city, and home to close to 2 million people. The group is now estimated to control an area larger than the size of the UK in a self-declared caliphate, straddling both Iraq and Syria. And while ISIL's goals appear clear, the fight against them has become even more complex and drawn out, being waged on vastly different battlegrounds in Syria, Iraq, and beyond. ISIL's expansion has been swift, dramatic, and violent. Fighters overran the Syrian city of Raqqa in March 2013, establishing it as the group's headquarters. As we said, Mosul then became ISIL's second de facto capital on June the 10th last year. And by the end of the month, the group formally declared the creation of a cross-border caliphate. A US-led aerial bombing campaign began in Iraq in August 2014, extending to Syria in September. ISIL responded by releasing the first video showing the beheading of a Western hostage, US journalist James Foley. Bringing us up to date, the city of Ramadi in central Iraq fell to ISIL last month, followed by Palmyra in Syria, home to priceless archaeological artifacts. Well, to discuss all of this, I'm joined by our guests. Here in the studio is Andreas Krieg, an assistant professor of defense studies at King's College London. In Washington, D.C., we have Andrew Tabler, a senior fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. And completing our panel in Oslo is Ayman Al-Tamimi, a fellow at the Middle East Forum and a specialist on armed groups in the Levant region. Welcome to you all. Let's begin with Andreas Krieg. Looking at an organization that uses terror as a tactic, but can that alone account for the amount of control that ISIS exercises?
Absolutely not. I think it's a very narrow look that is in Western media. It has been usually talked about as ISIS being primarily or exclusively a terrorist organization, which is not what they are. They are an insurgency organization, which obviously need to win over hearts and minds, and that's where they've proven to be quite sophisticated, because they were able to win over the hearts and minds and support of local communities in Syria, in Iraq, and in other places in the Middle East where the communities are disenfranchised. So the narrative of ISIS has been very sophisticated in kind of winning over these kind of communities who feel disenfranchised and left alone by governments and the international community at large. So ISIS is very much the alternative to any existing status quo in the region.
Well, Andrew Tabler, we heard there the phrase hearts and minds. Is ISIL succeeding in this?
I think that they are coming to the defense of Sunnis in particular, their demographic base, in places like Syria, where others were not coming to their defense. And that includes not just the international community, but also more moderate elements of the opposition. The other thing I think that's attractive for them is they're quite effective and coherent, and in the chaos of a place like political chaos and the military chaos and overall chaos, a place like Syria, that means a lot. And people over time tend to support a winner. And over time, ISIS has been able to attract some other groups besides their hardcore elements, including some tribes, through coercion and enticing them with incentives into their fold, and have thus expanded their territory further in the last year than I think most Western policymakers expected.
Well, Ayman Al-Tamimi, this tactic does appear to have solidified ISIL's control in many of the areas, does it not?
Yes, and it's particularly notable that with the declaration of the caliphate at the beginning of Ramadan last year, what you see is an evolution in the Islamic State's own administrative structure. Instead of being more localized with administrations covering limited aspects of life, you now have something that's purporting to be a like a central government with various state departments, so to speak. So, for example, the Diwan al-Ta'lim deals with education, the Diwan al-Siha deals with health, and the Diwan al-Khidmat deals with public services like electricity provision, and so on. And the bringing about of this kind of comprehensive system, although it does need to be subjected to some critical scrutiny. For example, we can ask the question of, how far is this actually just a case of co-opting services officers that were already in existence and compelling them to work, so to speak. And that's definitely the case in Iraq in particular. But regardless, it does bring a sense of order in a chaotic environment, and that helps to entrench this group. And the foremost problem we're facing is there is a lack of local opposition within the heartlands of their territories to challenge ISIL rule.
Well, let's just take a look at that structure that you mentioned. An investigation by the German magazine Der Spiegel has revealed how ISIL planned and later implemented a detailed intelligence system that helped its takeovers in Syria and Iraq. It obtained documents said to belong to a former intelligence chief under Saddam Hussein turned ISIL leader in Syria. The documents show how ISIL operated spy cells that would report to local and regional intelligence chiefs. The spies were sent out to collect all kinds of information, including lists of powerful families. They were also told to infiltrate rival rebel brigades and identify their leaders. ISIL spies were also ordered to uncover illegal activities that could be used to blackmail people in the future. Overall, the documents point to a complex system of surveillance designed to allow the group to control the people it ruled. Now, Andreas, Krieg, clearly this is a strategy that is very carefully thought through and sophisticated to an intense level.
Correct. I think we haven't seen that kind of sophistication with any jihadist group until today. I mean, the only way you could compare it to other Islamist organizations in terms of its organizational sophistication is maybe Hezbollah, obviously being a completely different type of organization. But ISIS is very sophisticated because they were able to bridge this gap between the Islamist ideologues and these people who used to work for the Ba'athist regime of Saddam Hussein. So they were able to embrace, on the one hand, tribes who themselves are not very religious, the Baathists, who by nature are actually secular people, and obviously ideologically motivated mujahideen, foreign fighters who come to fight jihad. All these three components, which on paper actually look like not compatible at all, have been merged into one very sophisticated system where there's a lot of delegation from the central core of ISIS, which is run from Raqqa or from Mosul, and then delegates a lot of power and authority to local civilian and military councils and on local level in Syria, in Iraq, but also now more and more in Libya and also in Yemen and other places where we see ISIS appearing. And this kind of structure is a quasi-state structure, and I agree with Ayman that this is something unheard of and unseen.
Well, Ayman al-Tamimi, you've also studied a number of similar documents and translated them. It's not only on the political aspect that they appear to be operating, but on the social one too, creating social services that, as we've heard in many areas, are lacking. Would that be correct?
Yes, that is correct. To comment specifically on those documents that Der Spiegel uncovered, that was definitely a key aspect of the expansion in Syria in 2013. In a way, the strategy was obsolete because it was predicated on the assumption there wouldn't be like a coordinated rebel movement to strike back at ISIL. But subversion was a very key part of the strategy of expansion. For example, whenever ISIL would go into a new area, they would set up a dawah office to ostensibly engage in religious outreach, and there was some of that, but then also, of course, as you mentioned, this intelligence gathering. So actually, in terms of ISIL propaganda in 2013 about advertising itself in Syria, the dawah aspect was a very heavy focus. And then into 2014 and to the present day, the expansion of services, so to speak, becomes much greater part of the propaganda, and of course it does translate to reality on the ground as well.
Well, Andrew Tabler, given all this information, has the battle against ISIL been undercut by the organization being perhaps reduced in terms of exactly how sophisticated and how carefully planned its operations are?
I think that it's been underestimated in terms of its capacities and the degree to which it's able to organize and to marshal the energies of the people in the areas in which they exist. But I think that there are larger reasons for its expansion. I think one of the major aspects of this is the regional context in which this is happening. We have a long, drawn-out war in Syria, different with the regime there being backed by Iran. And while many people in the region see ISIS as a threat, there are many others who see it as a bulwark against Iranian forces who, as some of the other guests said, organize in similar ways to ISIS, like Hezbollah and so on. So there are a lot of things that are fueling this fire. What we do know is that what's been done so far has not put it out, and in fact, it might have made it worse, particularly in areas of Syria.
Well, Andreas, Krieg, what is wrong with the tactics that have been employed to this date, particularly by the US, for example?
Right. I don't want to resort to some US bashing here and saying that it's all the Americans' fault. I think we all collectively, as the international community, local actors, states and non-state actors, as well as the West as well, we have to blame ourselves for not having done enough in Syria, for not having. Actually, it's not about the tactics. It's much more about developing a coherent strategy, and that's, I think, where we have failed. And until today, we don't have a strategy of how to fight ISIS. We have something that we call a strategy, which is purely based on military containment of a threat, which is not a military threat, but much more, as we said before, a socio-political threat or a socio-political problem. The root cause of ISIS is a socio-political problem of communities being disenfranchised and disempowered. And the only way that we will be able to solve the problem is by basically empowering and enfranchising these kind of communities, particularly in Syria, particularly in Iraq. And on the problem here is that the Americans so far have relied on a proxy in Iraq, which is part of the problem, which is the Baghdad regime and its militias and the security sector, and have failed to actually take the Sunnis on board sufficiently. I mean, I think there is a move now by the Americans to try to empower these Sunni communities, but again, until now, it's more about rhetoric. They haven't delivered on that rhetoric. And in Syria, the problem remains. For the last 4 years, the US hasn't done enough, the West hasn't done enough, and also Arab partners haven't done enough to actually find a strategy and say, this is what we have to do to solve the conflict. By just saying we're gonna support certain groups here and there, we're gonna strike ISIS, but at the same time we're gonna leave Assad in power. This is not a real coherent strategy, and it's going to fail. So we need to find a way to empower these communities, to give them an alternative, because right now they are in Syria faced with a choice of regime or Daesh. So many people are saying, I'm going with Daesh. In Iraq, it's the same story. Am I going with the regime, which they see as being a proxy of Iran, or am I going with ISIS? So the choice right now is, for many Sunnis, relatively easy, and saying, if someone can provide me with order, security, some sort of stability in times of chaos, I'll go with ISIS.
Well, Ayman al-Tamimi, the assertion there that ISIL actually seeks out fault lines and exploits the fault lines within the society, and that the tactics are failing because the fault lines themselves within these societies are not being addressed. What's your opinion of that view?
No, that's definitely true, and it's notable that in the expansion of ISIL abroad, they try to exploit the same fault lines, like the suicide bombings in Saudi Arabia, targeting the Shia. That was very much in keeping with the original strategy that ISIL leader Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi called for, which was to go for the Shia first because they know how to exploit that ever-growing fault line. And the problem that Saudi Arabia hasn't exactly treated its Shia minority as equals with the Sunni population, and so that has a potential also to become a whole new problem involving the ISIL dynamic within Saudi Arabia. And yes, the problems within Syria and Iraq, I think the fault lines, ethno-sectarian, these would take decades to resolve, if ever. My own view, I'm pretty pessimistic myself, though. I think this is a problem that's going to go on indefinitely with regards to ISIL, not really over the scale of a few years, as is being hoped with the current strategy of airstrikes and supporting limited groups.
Well, Andrew Tabler, you mentioned a few answers ago about the chaos in the areas in which ISIL is operating, which is yet again another weapon tactic that is employed. ISIL thrives on chaotic situations and particularly turning them around and bringing them under control. Is that an accurate analysis?
Yes, it is. I mean, I think Ayman put it well. But I guess I look at it. We have state failure in Syria and in Iraq, and you're unable to deal with and incorporate, particularly the Sunni populations in these countries, and that is a major problem because 5 years into the war, despite a lot of help from Iran, despite a lot of help from Hezbollah and getting all the breaks at the Security Council, and including from, at least concerning chemical weapons, from the White House, despite all of this, the regime has been unable to retake and hold all of its territory. It's been unable to shoot its majority Sunni population into submission, and that that's a trend that's just going to get worse. ISIS takes advantage of that, and they become the saviors, in a way, of the Sunni population. And with that, the longer that goes on, the more bloody and sectarian it gets, and the more solidified their grip is on these large swaths of Syria and Iraq. The other issue is there a way for it to leapfrog into other areas, either border countries of Syria and Iraq, or in some of these other areas like Libya and the Sinai and so on. You can see that they are able to politically and militarily organize themselves to take over existing groups and to spread their influence. And this has tremendous appeal among similar groups throughout the region who have a beef or an axe to grind with the West and with some of the regimes here in the region.
Andreas, Krieg, some contend that ISIL's major enemies are groups that, on the face of it, are strongly similar. However, the difference being that a number of these groups are fighting for nation. Al-Nusra in Syria, for example, they are emerging as the opponents of ISIL. They are emerging as the antidote to ISIL, are they not?
Correct, absolutely correct. And I think we need to look at Jabhat al-Nusra as a potential antidote to ISIS. We have seen an evolution of the jihadist threat in general. We have moved way beyond the global jihadist threat that we were facing 10 years ago. Today, the currency in jihadism in general is holding territory, providing public services, and providing public goods and social services, and interacting with local communities. This is the new currency of jihadist movements, and thereby we see Al-Qaeda, for example, has allowed its own franchises to emerge from Al-Qaeda, from core Al-Qaeda groups such as Ansar al-Sharia in Libya and Yemen, and Jabhat al-Nusra, who very much are being asked sent by the central leadership of Al-Qaeda to provide exactly this, provides socio-political organization and order in times of anarchy to local communities. And this is going to be, it's a Cold War between ISIS and Al-Qaeda affiliates.
Well, Ayman al-Tamimi, the evolution of these type of groups, I mean, originally Al-Qaeda, for example, were instructed by Osama bin Laden to avoid local issues and to focus all their activities on attacking the West. This is changing, is it not?
Yes, with Jabhat al-Nusra, of course, Abu Muhammad al-Julani, the leader, claimed that Ayman al-Zawahiri, the current leader of Al-Qaeda Central, had ordered him not to attack the West. And it's notable that Jabhat al-Nusra actually is a bit more of a complicated picture. They seem to be going in different directions depending on the period. I mean, last year, when they routed perceived Western-backed groups and allies of the West, Harakat Hizm and the Syrian Revolutionary Front, people perceived them to be taking a more hard line, and you could see that with the emergence of certain institutions that were clearly Nusra-affiliated, although officially independent, like the Dar al-Qadha, which would deal with judicial matters. But on the other hand, you have these recent gains in Idlib with the Jaish al-Fatah coalition that reflect like the old Nusra strategy of intertwining with the wider Syrian opposition and mainstreaming themselves as a brand, that it becomes very difficult for the Syrian rebel groups as a whole to shake them off. So yes, there is this. There have been these contrary trends pulling one direction or the other, but the overall direction it seems to be going in now is the sense that Al-Qaeda is like the moderate alternative to the Islamic State. And actually, I think that's quite dangerous because considering in the long term, eventually there is going to be the goal of attacking the West, and so mainstreaming makes it very difficult to get rid of them, and that's a huge problem.
Well, let's just pause here and take a look at financing. ISIL's been described as the richest armed group in history, with a budget estimated to be as high as $2 billion a year. The group started out by stealing and looting, later demanding taxes from shops and businesses and cuts from cross-border smuggling. The big money came from selling and trading oil from seized refineries. And ISIL has even created a Ministry of Antiquities to sell on the spoils from looted archaeological sites. Well, Andrew Tabler, a traditional way to fight what are labeled terrorist organizations has been to attack their funding. But in this particular case,
Sure.
that is not a easily reachable target, is it?
No, it's not. A lot of as you've mentioned, a lot of this trade is in kind. It's all outside of the major networks, finance networks. That's not to say all of it is. There's still plenty that could be done, but it's very difficult using existing tools, financial tools, to constrain this kind of organization.
Well, your view of that, Andreas Krieg, the concept of its financing actually reflecting its tactics as an organization. You can't get your hands on it. There's nothing tangible.
Correct. Exactly. There's nothing tangible, and it has been so diversified, and so much has been delegated to local middlemen, involving a network of people that naturally might not be the natural allies for ISIS, even involving people in Turkey, involving people in Lebanon, involving people in the Kurdish areas, who just want to make a quick buck. And this has helped the illicit trade of oil and hydrocarbons. It has aided the illicit trade of antiquities as well. The issue remains, though, that ISIS mainly can generate money from extortion, and that's what they've been doing. And this is something that we as the international community, as outsiders, cannot really interfere with. And the problem is, when it comes to financing, the amount of money that comes from donors from outside, which has always been blown out of proportion, is a very small fraction of the money that ISIS can generate as a quasi-state. They are a quasi-state who have they have a GDP just by the production of oil, by the antiquities they can sell, and obviously by other extortion money that they can generate.
Well, Ayman al-Tamimi, the point being made there that groups like Al-Qaeda were funded from the outside largely. ISIL is not. There is no outside funding that you can attach or attack. Is this once again part of the evolution of how these groups operate?
Yes, it is definitely part of the evolution from external reliance to self-reliance. In contrast, actually, some other jihadist groups in Syria didn't fare so well because they were very dependent on, say, funding from private Gulf donors, and then when measures were taken to crack down on that, they really had no choice but to dissolve themselves. And so, for example, one in Latakia, the Sukur al-Iz, ended up joining Jabhat al-Nusra because they had funding problems in the end, and they were reliant on private donors. Whereas ISIL, in contrast, because of this state presentation, they can really co-opt many local means of making revenue. So, for example, they can put phone subscriptions under their landline phone subscriptions under their Diwan al-Khidmat. They can take revenues from school registration fees as part of their Diwan al-Ta'lim, the education department. And now, actually, in contrast, say Jabhat al-Nusra doesn't quite have that state presentation. There's much better evidence that even in places where Jabhat al-Nusra is quite strong and seems to control towns as strongholds in parts of Idlib, for example, there are still local civilian councils that more or less operate independently of them, whereas ISIL puts a big emphasis on co-opting that under their own labels and state departments, and as a result, there are so many different avenues for making money. Really, you'd have to dismantle that state structure. You'd have to destroy ISIL, so to speak. But,
a complex situation that has emerged over the year. That brings us to an end of our discussion. My thanks to Andrew Tabler, Ayman al-Tamimi, and Andreas Krieg. And thank you for watching. As always, we would like to hear your thoughts. You can contact us on our program page at aljazeera.com. You can also post your comments at facebook.com/AJ Inside Story or tweet us at AJ Inside Story. From me, Mike Hanna, and the whole team here, goodbye for now.